So, as Zoanne said, I am Natasha Hollenbach. I am the Digital Services Technician here at the Historical Society, and today I'm going to talk to you all about newspaper research for genealogy. So, as Zoanne said, and as my title implies, most of what I do works with the digital newspapers. But of course, the whole point of today was to talk about our new microfilm readers. So I'm going to sort of combine those two ideas. Usually when I talk about newspapers, I'm talking about these two resources. So Chronicling America, which I hope many of you have heard of, but it is a national project which is hosted by the Library of Congress, and there are lots and lots of Montana newspapers in there. But Montana Newspapers is actually a new repository that just went live last March, and there are two completely different data sets. So you really kind of have to look at both. One of the big differences, though, is that Chronicling America ends at the end of 1922, whereas Montana Newspapers has newspapers up to 2014. And this is just my really fast map to kind of show you some of the geographic coverage. The blue dots are Chronicling America, and they are slightly misleading because of the Chronicling America project. Most of those date runs are pretty small. They tend to be 2 up to 10 years, but there are very few that have more than that. Whereas the purple dots, which is Montana Newspapers, tend to have much longer runs. So this is one of the things that we always tell people, that even though there are a lot of pages and a lot of issues online, it's really only about 5% of Montana newspapers are digitized. So the microfilm readers that we all got and that we're telling you about, they will continue to be in your lives. They are not going anywhere. And it occurred to me when I was thinking about this last night that at this point in the presentation, the obvious question is going to be, how do you find out what we have on microfilm? And, yay, my link is going to work. So this is going to take us to the homepage of the Historical Society. And someday, yes, I will resist humming Jeopardy at it. Although that is always an option. And you know, I just did this before we started this presentation, and it went on fine. And then again, maybe I will not show it to you. All right, there we go. It just made me want to work for it. Okay, so from the home page, you're going to go to the Research tab and Research Collections. And then down here for newspapers, there's a lot of links for all sorts of information about newspapers. But if you click on this first one, it takes you to the data set that has all of the newspapers. Right now, it's organized by county, but you can always come over here to city and go down, and then you go down and you scroll, and then you find your town, and it'll tell you the date range, but it'll also tell you what format it's in. So just so you all have seen it. So now we're going to get to the fun part of this presentation. I always think of genealogy as a puzzle that's been broken apart. The pieces are scattered and hidden. And so when you're doing genealogy research, you're trying to find all the puzzle pieces again, bring them all together, and then try to reassemble it. And it really, as I think most of you know, is as hard as it sounds. So generally, we talk about the records that you're finding for your ancestors. But there are newspapers that both supplement, but they also bring kind of depth that some of these records just don't really do. I mean, if you have the census record that says that they're living in Missoula, well, that's fine and that's useful. But if you end up in the Missoula paper and you find out that, you know, you might have a case where their wife was really big on the social scene, and she's having musicals and all sorts of stuff in her place. That's the fun part of history, are the stories behind the dates and behind the names. So at this point, I thought it would be useful to just kind of hit some of the highlights for why people are in newspapers. And this is a list that we came up with several months ago for a different presentation, and we all know this is not a full list. But looking at it, you can kind of see that it falls into three main categories. You've got the major life events, you've got your kind of social scene kind of things, and then there's the category that I'm calling "you came to the attention of the authorities." Either through crime, or because you didn't pay your taxes, or for whatever other reason, you now have a permanent record. And the thing about genealogy research is we've all seen the census records or even the newspaper articles where they're not entirely right. They've got a date wrong, or they're spelling someone's name wrong, or something is wrong, but it's still the same person that you're looking for. So that's why I say that the first principle of genealogy research is verify, which becomes kind of an interesting process to try to find, because it means instead of just finding one piece of information, you've got to find it in multiple different places. And that's where we all have those stories that we know most of the details and some of them just kind of get filled in. I like to say that the family stories, I think it's a generational game of telephone, because the more generations removed you are, sometimes your families are really good at transmitting the entire story, and sometimes you look and it's a couple generations and you're like, where in the world did that come from? So, when you're looking at microfilm, we all know one of the questions that I was asked recently is, how much information do you need to have before you come in to do newspaper research? And this is going to be the first place where I tell you that it differs from microfilm to digital. Microfilm, you really do have to have a where and a when. If you come up to us in the reference room and you say, I'm looking for my grandfather who was in Montana in 1909, we're going to look at you and go, okay, that's nice, where? So it can be problematic. And of course, the other limitation of the microfilm is that you can only look at that one date range at a time. And I have up there, the page count goes high really, really quickly. And we do have people who come in and are looking at microfilm for days on end, and that's all they look at for 3 or 4 hours. And just to kind of give you a sense of that, if you've never actually done it, I have an 8-page issue here that we're going to sit here and scroll through. And then imagine that you have to zoom in and zoom out to look, to scan all of these pages to see if the person you're looking for is on them. And it keeps going. And then going. And you're only on page 6. But the good thing about doing the microfilm, though, is that you are very thorough. When you're done, you don't have this sense that maybe I missed it because you obviously looked at every page. However, I'm going to suggest that if you really do go through all these pages, that issue was from the Helena Weekly Herald, 1889. By that point, and certainly by 1900, the newspapers are usually pretty consistent. They put the same types of articles on the same page in each issue. So for this particular newspaper, pages 7 and 8 are the ones who do local news. And then you can get even better because you can find the headlines for those sections. So for this one, it was the local news, the personal, and then town and territory. Local news is one of those common ones that's in most newspapers, but every newspaper has slightly different titles. But if you figure out what they are, then you can just look for those and then read those. And that's 6 pages every issue that you don't have to read, which can make it at least a little easier. Although I will admit that sometimes the articles that you find that you're not looking for are sometimes even more fascinating than the ones that you're actually looking for. But, you know, it is an option if you really are trying to focus. So for the next I wanted to pull out a few articles that I found on those 2 pages just to kind of give you a sense of what you can find. This particular individual apparently made lots of news because he had 2 different articles on the same day. The one on the left was actually from local news and the one on the right was from personal. So that is an example of just because you found them in one article doesn't mean that you should ignore the rest of the issue. It may be that there are multiple examples of them. These are some of my favorite little articles. They're those 1 or 2 sentence articles. And this one is actually amazing because it tells you not only where she went, that she was visiting her son-in-law, but it also gives you his name and his job. And this is actually going to come back to haunt you in a few slides when I talk about searching on the digital papers. But these are definitely pieces of information to keep. The next couple, this one is a marriage announcement, and they're actually from Boulder, but they got married in Helena. And so you do come across those where, you know, you're looking in the records for Jefferson County and you're not going to find them. And so sometimes the newspapers can tell you where it is that you should be looking. And then this is one of the great articles that I found for this presentation. This man actually came to Helena 1866. And so if you were looking for him, we would send you to the Montana Death Index. But he died in Massachusetts when he was visiting his daughter, and he was buried there. So you're not going to find him in the Montana records. But thankfully, he was in the newspaper, so you can find him that way. And this is one of those kind of odd tensions in the newspapers, because if sometimes people come in and they come out and they're only here for 2 or 3 years and they live that nice quiet life, and so they didn't make the newspapers. Sometimes they have enough connections that you still find them even though they were only here a year. You know, you just never really know what you're going to find in the newspapers, which makes it exciting, but sometimes a little frustrating. Which brings you to the digitized newspapers. And they really do require different mindsets. You know, for the microfilm, you can just go, okay, I'm going to look this city, this paper, these years, done. Whereas the digital, because it's casting a wider net, you have to put a little bit more thought into certain things. For instance, when you're looking at the microfilm, if you come across an article and the name is close enough, you're probably going to read it and you're going to be able to tell if it's the person you're looking for. The digital world is different. You have to actively be searching for alternate names. This is I know, right? It's crazy. So I was searching for this murder case and I was looking for the murder victim, and I was only finding 1, maybe 2 articles, and I couldn't understand what exactly was going on. So I ended up searching for the murderer instead, and they all kept popping up. So you really do have to actively be looking, because the digital search is looking specifically for what you type in that search box. It's not going to it's not going to do autocorrect for you. It's not going to tell you what you're searching for. It's going to take you at your word. The other thing that this example shows, though, is that you don't want to necessarily just be looking for who you're particularly looking for. It's like what I was saying with that little one sentence blurb. You know, think of who they're associated with. Think of other family members. If they have a business partner, if they owned a business, search for the business. You know, sometimes, I know Zoanne said that sometimes I cut straight to the heart of the problem, but when dealing with newspapers, sometimes you do have to come at it sideways in order to get to where you're going. And I have this example, which I'm sure most of you know about, but it's always a challenge searching for women because, you know, when you're not married, you're like Miss Sarah Baker down here where you have a first name. Whereas once you get married, you're your husband's name or his initials. Which brings me to one of the other ideas about searching for names. Don't just search for the formal name. Search for what they're known for. Search for a middle name. Search for initials. You know, anything you can think of, it's gonna pay off. And then you come to the other fun thing about doing digitized newspapers. So you run into it occasionally in the microfilm, but nowhere near what you do when you search digital. There are a lot of people with the same names in the world. And this particular instance, I was doing a search for A.J. King. And he lived in Kalispell, you know, early 1900s. But in the late teens, early 20s, he was a U.S. Customs inspector. So he was showing up all over the state. And so I was doing my search and searching through all of these, and there was an A.J. King in Missoula. And I'm like, well, that was interesting. I wonder what he was doing there. And I will admit it took me a lot longer than it should have to realize that it was the wrong A.J. King. And the way I did it wasn't because of articles about him specifically. It was articles about the family. And I started realizing this is not the same wife and those children have different names. This is obviously someone different. So, and that goes back to that whole find and then verify. It's an important thing to think about. So, with that said, I'm going to open it up to questions or discussions. But I know, as Zoanne said, that you all have a lot more experience doing some of these. So are there any strategies that you all use that are particularly useful or something that you did that you never ever want to do again that you'd like to share with the group? Mm-hmm.
Well, I found that my grandmother was involved in a murder, an accessory to a murder in Sturgis, South Dakota. And it was never known by anybody in the family. It was kept a secret. And there were comments that were made to her by my mother, and that she heard some of the other her uncles call her a jailbird, but nobody knew what that meant. Now, to make a short story long, she was not found guilty or anything. She was just an accessory, happened to be at the wrong spot at the wrong time. But I think the value of newspapers, I stumbled onto it.
Mm-hmm.
And it came from a newspaper in Iowa. But the murder took place in Sturgis, South Dakota in 1910. So the value of persevering, and then you got to go back and explain this to all your cousins. And they're going to say, my grandmother was the most wonderful person in the world. How could you ever say anything like this? So you got to be careful how you approach the rest of the family and say, okay, are you a rational person? Do you have a gun? So my point being is you need to be really patient and don't be too excited about finding a grandmother who was an accessory to murder.
Well, and I'm going to go for two things off of that. First is that I always, for Chronicling America, one of the reasons I love that is because it is national. And so you can start with Montana and then expand outwards. But the approaching family members, I've watched probably too much Who Do You Think You Are? And it's come to me that there are kind of two versions of people who look for genealogy. There are the ones who are like fun stories. Oh my gosh, can you believe that my ancestor was involved in this? And then there are the others who take it really personally. And it's a personal indictment of you about what happened 100 years ago. And you're right, it's sometimes, if you're the first version, you kind of have to be careful.
But my point being is that the value of being able to search newspapers
Mm-hmm.
and be patient
Mm-hmm.
And you just don't jump up on find stuff off the cuff. And then half the stuff that you do get, you're not sure, is this really factual?
Right.
So what you're saying is very, very true.
And the newspapers, you know, I always point out that they're created by people. There's this tendency to call newspapers the first draft of history, and I'm not a huge fan of that version or of that phrase, because they're not doing history. They're doing what they think they know at the time. I think of it more as a time portal to that particular day or that particular week. I mean, if you look at, and this is going slightly off genealogy, but I was looking at the speculator mine fire. And of course, as that, you know, over that week, the death toll changes. And it's not that the early ones are wrong, it's just that they didn't know what the truth was. And sometimes you find that when you're doing murder cases, or you're finding, or someone just heard a name wrong, you know, or they spelled it wrong. One of the things that I didn't pull up, but when you're searching for people, you've also got to think about how they were abbreviating names. Because especially in the early papers, they're hand doing all of those letters, and you know, sometimes they're taking shortcuts on how to spell things. Or sometimes it's just they need to fit that article in this particular space, so let's save some letters and do it this way. One of the ones that I think is kind of odd is that Mac, either MC or MAC, sometimes gets abbreviated M apostrophe. Like, it's only saving you a space or two, but that's how they do it.
When you're doing a search on, say, the Montana newspaper, are you bringing up each edition and searching, or is it able to search everything?
So, let me go over there. It's, however you filtered it, it's searching all of them, and it'll bring up each page where those results are. And that's one of the things that I suggest, because it gives you multiple ways to search, and I usually do it either as a phrase or do the proximity search, because these two, they'll have a tendency to give you, like if you're looking for John Smith, it will give you everything that has John or Smith. Or it'll be, you know, it's John Coulter and William Smith, you know, are on that, but because both of those words are there, they're together. So, yeah. Yeah.
You do one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, and then if you come down here, you can do it so that you can limit your date range.
What was that other newspaper? Is it national?
It's Chronicling America.
Chronicling America?
Yep. You can tell we've used it too many times, it comes up automatically.
So the Montana Memory Project has been rolled into Montana.
Yes. Yes. And there are, Montana Newspapers is growing, so it will continue to add newspapers.
Two questions, I guess. Is there a trick to finding where other states may have state newspapers rather than Chronicling America, but in addition to?
There's not really any trick to it. We really, yeah. Certain states are further along than others are. I know, like California, Nebraska, I think North Carolina. There are a few that sort of have their version of Montana newspapers, only more so. But then there's a lot of states that don't. Usually it's through either the main university or the state library, though.
Second question I had is a different one. I have a relative that has the same name as a baseball player, and so when you search the name, you get
Right.
box score. So
Yeah.
is there a way you can say Bill Smith, not baseball?
Yeah. First of all, I'm sorry. There is. They actually didn't do a not function for most of the searching. The only thing I can think of is, well, if you had something else about him or if you knew where he was from, you might add that into your list. Do it, and I would also do it as a proximity so that it would be his name and then whatever other term you're using. But you're right, that's going to be a particular. It's in every newspaper, yeah. Yeah, I'm not really, I don't have a good answer for you.
If you were going to look for the women's suffrage movement, what would you start with?
I would start, well, I would start and I would narrow down by time and I would do suffrage and see where that went and then try to narrow it if you're looking for particular people or if you're looking for a particular area. But some of these searches, you kind of have to try it 3 or 4 ways before you find the best way to work it. I'm trying to remember if we have an awesome volunteer. Well, we have many awesome volunteers, but one of our volunteers went in and she's been doing these particular things for different topics that she's interested in, and it has, key dates, but it also down here will tell you what to search for, and she has suffrage on here, so that apparently is a decent search term. Which doesn't help you. All right.
All the newspapers in your collection microfilmed, or do you still have some that are only original microfilm?
Most of what we have, that's an excellent question. There are. I know we're just finishing microfilming 2012 and starting 2013, so anything after that is definitely print. We do have isolated different special editions and things that are only on print, and actually the list that I pulled up that had our list, there is in format, there is a print only, so those will show up too.
Isn't the digitizing of all the newspapers in the country a national project that is being funded through the federal government? Or am I off base there?
Chronicling America is funded through NEH, but it only goes up to 1922 because once you hit 23, you start running into copyright. And so it's not really being...
Pre-1922?
Up, yeah.
And what is the status of that effort? Is it close to being done, or where is it at?
So generally speaking, Chronicling America, and it's actually the National Digital Newspaper Project. It's actually in DNP, but Chronicling America is what's come out of it. Generally speaking, they give states 3 rounds of funding, 2 years each. It's generally for 100,000 pages per 2 years. I think that we're at about 29 states now, plus Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. There are a couple of those states like Georgia that's never going to join because they had money and they did their own version. But I don't want to say it's winding down, but I mean, they're never going to be completely, they're never going to get everything done. But they've actually started giving fourth round funding to people, but you have to be gone for at least, for generally they're not giving fourth rounds of funding until you've been out of the project for a couple of years.
So what is the next level of technology after microfilming? And, you know, at first it was microfiche, now it's microfilm. What's going to be the next level that is going to be accessible to people like us?
Well, there are and several of the states who were in NDNP are now working together. The Montana Newspapers is actually using the open source version of the Chronicling America software, and that's what many of the states are using to make them interoperable. I know we sort of have a grand hope that one day Montana Newspapers will become at least regional as opposed to just us. But at this point, microfilm is still the archive standard because the digital is changing so quickly and no one's quite sure how funding is going to be long term. I don't know if that actually answered, but that's...
I mean, my point is that you get all geared up and say, oh, I'm going to go do this.
Yeah.
Sorry, but the cow moved, you know?
Yeah. Well, and there are, and one of the nice things about the group that's working on the software is that there are certain things that they do want to improve with the software. Like we want to get better OCR, and we want to, so that those searches are better. There are also several other things that they're working on with it, which will hopefully move that software further along and keep it a little bit more updated so that hopefully we can move as the cow moves. And it also makes it helpful because it means multiple states are pooling resources and we're not all trying to reinvent the wheel.
So if we find something and flip it
Mm-hmm.
out of the newspaper or whatever, can that be posted onto a website? Or are there copyright limitations, et cetera? Because right now it's available.
Right. It's one of those fair use things. If you just have an article, you're probably okay, but you're not going to want to repost, whole issues or, and you'll definitely want to cite it and say, that you got it from Montana Newspapers. Anything on Chronicling America, you can do whatever you want with because it's out of copyright. All right. Yep.
Last year I had some good luck with Find a Grave because I found all these obituaries in there.
Right.
Yeah.
And previously I had obituaries. Sometimes they vary according to location, that they might not be exactly the same. But they've obviously copied them. But it does say where it came from too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those, and I think because genealogy is such a growing field and a growing interest, it is one of those that I personally wonder how it's going to go in the future, in that when things first started, everyone just kind of put it up, and now everyone's going, oh, we could make money on it. Let's put it behind a subscription wall. And that's one of the reasons why we created Montana Newspapers, to try to get them online in a free format, as opposed to getting the public libraries working with newspaper archives or any of those other subscription databases and just losing those newspapers entirely.
Would you repeat on the national database what year that starts?
Nationally, it starts 1836. For Montana, it starts with the Montana Post, 1864.
But it's hit and miss. I mean, that's what you said before. It's not a continuous data set for a given state or a given community.
Yeah, and one of the fastest ways to do it is to come over to the all digitized newspapers and pick the state, and then it will show you what's available, the earliest and the latest issue. And it's one of those, part of the NDNP selection process, and we, every state that does it, they have a selection board that works on it, but you're trying to get both the temporal coverage and the geographic coverage. You're trying to hit all the major events, and it's very difficult. But yeah, it does mean that sometimes you're looking for something and we have that town and newspaper, but we stopped, 2 months before what you need. And I'm sorry. But that's why the microfilm is amazing. And microfilm is one of the few things that we actually do interlibrary loan. So people who aren't in Helena, but their local library has a microfilm machine reader, they can interlibrary loan it and read it there. Any other questions? Are we ready to wrap it up? All right. Well, thanks for coming. I do have, so that is my email, and of course I'm on the staff directory on the website if you ever need to get a hold of me, or Tina Kirkham. She's the one who actually runs Montana newspapers, so she's a good one to ask questions to also.